Rick Atkinson spent the first quarter century of his working lifetime in daily journalism. For almost 30 years now, he's been reporting history. 9 volumes thus far, centered largely on the military's role in the making of America and the execution of its foreign policies. Along the way, he has won essentially every literary award, including 3 Pulitzers. He was a central on-camera source for the Ken Burns documentary series on the American Revolution. His portraits of soldiers in combat, including his 3 volumes on the rescue of Europe and North Africa in World War II, those books have been universally praised as scholarship and craftsmanship of the highest order. His latest project is another trilogy, this one involving the birth of our nation on its battlefields. The recently published 2nd volume of that series was chosen by the Arkansas Center for the Book for the project known as If All Arkansas Read the Same Book. And as part of our America 250 observances, we welcome Rick Atkinson to Arkansas and to our airwaves. Thank you so very much for this time.
Thank you, Steve. I'm pleased to be here.
Nothing about this period in America, nothing about the Revolution was guaranteed. There were no safe harbors, as it were.
That's true. David McCullough once said that in good narrative history, there's no such thing as a foreseeable future. And there's no such thing as a foreseeable future when you're living the events at the time. The likelihood of the Americans successfully extracting themselves from the British Empire, defeating the professional British Army and the Royal Navy, the greatest navy the world had ever seen, the odds were really stacked against them. So the idea that they're going to be able to fight for 8 years, as the revolution is going to last for 8 years, and come out of it with their ambitions realized, the ambition to detach themselves from the empire, to form the basis of a new republic, to have half a continent given to them in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, all the way to the Mississippi River, seems very improbable when it all begins in 1775.
Is there a way to summarize, is there a thumbnail explanation? How did they pull it off, splitting from the crown?
You know, I think we know from our national history that when you're fighting a counter-insurrection, you're trying to suppress an insurrection, particularly if it's an expeditionary war, you have to go somewhere to do it, you have to win. We know this from Vietnam, we know it from Afghanistan, we know it from Iraq. We have to win. If you are the insurrectionists, if you're fighting on your home turf, you have to not lose. Washington comes to recognize that. He doesn't articulate it in quite the same way, but he certainly comes to the realization. And that's what they've got going for them. They have to not lose for 8 years, whereas the British have to win. It's a matter of outlasting them, of bleeding them nick by nick, of wearing down British will, both in the military and the body politic at home. So I think that ultimately is the secret to success in the revolution.
You were a central figure, I think it's fair to say, in the Ken Burns documentary series on the American Revolution. So you had, it seems to an observer, to be, it was a hybrid work, you know, the printed page and the moving image. It was a collaborative sort of effort there.
Yes, his work was harder, I think, because Ken and Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt all had to recreate something that happened 250 years ago without having the benefit of photographs, without having the benefit of living veterans to talk about it, without having, obviously, any footage available. Watching them do it, watching them come up with the techniques, the artistry to recreate the American Revolution in great fidelity to history, I have to say, was a pleasure and a privilege. My task is to create with words a picture that the reader can take and imagine what it looks like and what it sounds like and what it smells like. Well, they're doing the same thing, but with a different medium and with greater complexity in some respects. I think the 12-hour, 6-part thing they did for PBS was really terrific.
Heighten your appreciation of the documentary form?
Absolutely. I've never been involved with it as I was this time. Heightened my appreciation for that treasure, national treasure we call Ken Burns, for his extraordinary patience and his commitment to history, his patriotism, all of those things. I think they all are part of the ingredients that go into that particular film.
You're a lifelong student of history, and the enormous research that went into this trifecta, if I may call it, that's one in the making anyway. We've got 2 volumes now.
Knock wood.
Did it reshape or some way reconfigure your appreciation of that era and what it took to break away from the empire?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's one of the pleasures of doing what I'm doing, is an opportunity to go much deeper than I ever have before. My knowledge of the American Revolution was pretty superficial, I think. I'd spent a lot of time writing about more contemporary wars. I know World War II in Europe quite well. I know Vietnam. I know more recent wars, including the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Persian Gulf War. I think I had a lot of the misconceptions that many Americans have about the characters, the events, the mythology for the revolution. And this, for me, was an opportunity to try to get to ground truth about George Washington, about Benjamin Franklin, about all the other characters involved, and about the British. We tend to stereotype George III and the whole British effort, stupid lobster backs, and that's wrong. It's much more complex than that. So part of my ambition has been to really, first of all, demolish the mythological parts of the revolution, to make the characters three-dimensional, to tell the story of the revolution, including all the ugly parts, and there are quite a few ugly parts.
Living, breathing, swimming in the research that you did for this era. Can you look at those events of almost 250 years ago, look at those events and see that they in some way, or did they shape the America that we know today, or the Arkansas that we know today?
Oh, I think...
Is that too much of a stretch?
No, I don't think it is. I think, the revolution remains a bright mirror in some ways in which we see characteristics of the American character, traits that form the American character, and they include ingenuity, perseverance, commitment, brutality, pugnacity. All of these things are part of who we are, who we became. They were all part of the stew back at the beginning of the country. So I think that, we see those founders wrestling with some of the same issues that perplex us today. The obligations of citizenship, the limits of executive power, many other things that seem very contemporary to Americans in 2026 would have been very familiar to those in 1776.
Yeah. You came from a military family. Army brat,
yes.
You might say. Your father was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, I think. Obviously, that had to shape your or that was formative for you in terms of your life's work. It's much of it involved the American military.
Yes, I think, Steve, that's absolutely
many true. Wars in three or four continents.
Yes. Yeah, I grew up in the Army. My father enlisted in 1942 when he turned 18. He came back from Europe in 1946. He went to Penn State and he went back into the Army because he'd liked it. And so I traveled with him and the rest of the family from post to post around the country, starting in Austria. We lived in Austria the first 3 years of my life when Austria was still partitioned and the army was there. And so I know the culture, I know the lingo, I know the acronyms. I think I understand the heritage of the Army pretty well as a consequence of growing up in it. And even though I was never part of it, I had an appointment to the West Point class of '74 and turned it down at the last minute. Saved the Army a lot of trouble. Nevertheless, I've always been interested in it, and I think that telling the story of our wars and our military is essential to understanding the country, who we are, what we became, because it's a fundamental part of the whole American story.
Well, is it not possible or even highly probable that the military recognized that in you? I mean, your sources are just incredible. I mean, the way you were able to get inside the story.
It's been a good symbiotic relationship, I think. I've been writing about war my entire professional life, 50 years now. As a journalist, as a war correspondent, foreign correspondent, I think that I got a reputation for ground truth being an important part of what it was that I was doing, of honoring what they're doing without being subservient to them. I'm not carrying water for them then or now. But I think the fact that I have some, basic understanding of military life, the sacrifices that are made, the burden that falls on the entire family. I've been there myself. The love that blooms on battlefields among comrades, which is unlike any other kind of love in the human space. All of that, I think, has given me access and entree, for which I'm very appreciative.
Yeah. I watched a conference, was able to watch a conversation you had some years back with a compatriot of sorts from Great Britain, Sir Max Hastings. Right?
Yes.
And in which the two of you discussed a tendency among some, not all, to, in retrospect, kind of romanticize war, to look at it with, I think the term was nostalgia, almost like that. You are among that cat. You're not guilty of that. You've not.
I work hard to avoid it.
Yeah.
Max Hastings, one of my closest pals, and a very fine historian, also a former newspaperman. We deplore the romanticizing of war. Both of us have seen it ourselves. Both of us have written about it a lot. We know that fundamentally war is about dead boys and sobbing mothers. And anything that you do that strays too far from that core truth about war does a disservice to those who fought it. It runs the risk of romanticizing it and making it easier to undertake as a nation. I think Max and I both feel that it's really important for wise civic decisions to be made by democracies, including the most profound decision, which is whether to go to war or not, by the electorate, and that they need to understand clearly, without any illusions, that first of all, it never goes the way you think it's going to go. Secondly, that it is a profound commitment of a nation to support the military wherever that war is going to take you. And that is a real commitment. And we've seen the country lose heart on occasion, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not good reasons. The country needs to understand going into any conflict precisely what the risks are.
Yeah. Do you think you and others of like mind, journalists, historians of like mind, Tim O'Brien comes to mind, the late Mr. Caputo comes to mind, do you think you've succeeded in in pushing the face of war into the face of the country in a positive way.
Yeah, I don't know how positive it is. Others may feel they don't want it pushed.
Meaningful way, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, Tim O'Brien, Phil Caputo, I revere those guys. First of all, for what they went through. Second, for how they captured it. And third, for how they also are very unromantic about it. They try to tell the story with the bark stripped off. And I think that Americans, if what I write gives Americans, first of all, a better appreciation for the sacrifice it's made for everyone involved when the country goes to war, and to make Americans think, okay, this is real serious. This is as serious as it gets. And as a good citizen, I need to take it seriously.
We're coming up on 250, a quarter of a millennium. And there would seem to be a great division in the country. As an historian who has chronicled, as you have, so much of history from our very founding, you optimistic? Can we come together?
You know, as an American, I feel that optimism is part of our birthright. I am optimistic. For one thing, as a historian, I know that regardless of the travails afflicting us in 2026, when the country seems divided, when partisan bickering is ever more toxic, we've gone through much worse in the past. We have survived revolution, we have survived civil war, 2 world wars, Great Depression, and on and on. Existential crises that have tested our mettle, have showed that we're made of pretty stern stuff, as it turns out, particularly when the chips are down. So my feeling is that as disheartening as 2026 can be today, that it's nothing compared to what we have survived previously. And that we should draw strength from that knowledge, knowing that we have endured these previous crises and come out the other side. Look back 250 years, we've come a long way in tolerance, diversity, sheer scale. That also should be very comforting to us, that the trajectory of the country, in my estimation, as a historian, as a citizen, has generally tended up, with certainly ripples in it, and that gives me optimism.
Historians aplenty, Mr. McCullough comes to mind, that you mentioned, have lamented what they see is a serious deficit in America's civic education, and they attribute that to no small extent on the sidelining of history. We don't seem to study history as we can. We've assigned the humanities, kind of pushed them to the side. You share that concern?
Yes, I'm not an educator, so I'm not in the trenches with middle school, high school teachers, college professors, but I feel their pain. I hear their laments. I share their worry, I think. It's not a zero-sum game, education. You don't have to stress STEM, the sciences and math and technology and all the rest of it, at the expense of liberal arts. I was an English major. You would think coming out of a graduate school with a degree in English, what are you going to do with that? Well, it turns out quite a few people have managed to blunder ahead in life. I do worry that ignorance about our national history, ignorance about the strengths the country has shown over 250 years, helps to potentially undercut our strength. The body politic becomes more fragile if you don't really understand how we got here, how we've surmounted past problems, past crises, how we have advanced over 250 years. 250 years ago, in the period we're talking about in the American Revolution, there were 2.5 million people in this country. 500,000 of them were enslaved blacks. They didn't really have a stake in the fine words, all men are created equal. Also, it didn't apply to women. It didn't apply to immigrants. It didn't apply to Native Americans. It was aspirational. And the notion that we have taken those aspirational thoughts enunciated by Jefferson and have gradually over time made them real, and still aspirational, there's no doubt about that, made them realer, is a reason for great pride, I think, and again, a reason for optimism. People have to understand that. Kids have to understand that because the stakes are enormous for everybody in keeping the efforts to make those aspirations tangible and real for now 340 million Americans.
I think we're hearing you say we're selling ourselves short as Americans.
You know, I do think there's some hand-wringing going on, and I loathe hand-wringing. You know, better to use those hands to get to work on something. I think that it's important for Americans to recognize that even as deficient we have been at moments in our history, and we've done things that we cannot be particularly proud of, including slavery, that's behind us. Let's move forward. Let's take the lessons that we learned along that 250-year journey and keep adding to it.
You ever miss daily journalism?
I would be lying if I said yes, simply because I know how difficult it's become. I see what happened to my old newspaper, the Washington Post, and they still put out a good newspaper every day. It's just not the magnificent newspaper that it once was, and I don't think that's just the soft haze of retrospection. I began to feel at the end of my time there that it was really a young person's profession, particularly reporting, that it became more and more difficult for me to think, okay, I'm going to go chase this story somewhere. So I admire it. I admire those who do it. I want it to survive. I think it's really important to the Republic, but I don't really miss it.
You immerse yourself and spend years on a project. And I mentioned daily journalism. Now it's essentially hourly journalism, is it not? Every newspaper, I mean, it constantly updates, and then you...
Yeah, and you know, again, I admire their ability to do it, but you know, back in my day, if you were, you know, filing 2 stories a day, or maybe 3 if it was really busy, that was really something. And you know, now they're basically filing for AMs, PMs, radio, the web, different platforms, this platform, that platform, doing this. You know, I worry, and I've still got friends in the business, I worry that there's less time for reflective thought, that that extra beat or 2 that you need to think it through and to think through the story and to think through how you're going to capture the story is not there because there's so many demands on journalists today. Nevertheless, you know, the younger generations come along and they've got faculties that I don't have, and more power to them.
Well, something else that's come along, and that's the rise of social media, and the rise of social media, where you can have, shall we say, your own facts.
Yeah.
Does that not make the job of elevating the public discourse and an appreciation of history and our civic life infinitely more difficult?
I think it does. I think, you know, people get in their silos and they have a set of beliefs and facts, and there's an echo chamber, and those beliefs and facts are reverberating, and it's hard to crack into that. And to the extent that, you know, some folks obviously believe that there is no such thing as ground truth, that It's all kind of subjective, and it tends to reinforce your predispositions and your prejudices and all the rest of that. I don't think that's healthy, and I don't know how to fix it other than to encourage everyone, young people in particular, to use a multiplicity of sources. You don't just go to, Fox. You don't just go to MSN, or you don't just go to NPR for your view of the world. You kind of aggregate these things, and somewhere in there you're likely to find something that approximates truth.
Yeah. How far along are we on volume 3 of this one?
Not far enough. I've had a little difficulty getting real traction. I've been at it. I've done research in places like the British Library, and I was at the Huntington Library in California. I was at the New York Historical, which has a wonderful library, very recently. But I need long stretches of uninterrupted concentration, particularly to do the archival research that's required. Yeah. I need weeks on end, and I am not quite there yet, but I'm doing a lot of reading of secondary stuff, and I'll get there.
In the room where you write, is there a window?
Yeah, there's a window. I live in the District of Columbia, and I look out on a thumb of Rock Creek Park, which is the central park of Washington. I'm a gardener. I'm a very passionate, if sometimes ham-handed gardener, and I look out on my garden, which right now in the late spring in Washington is pretty glorious. I don't find it distracting. It's an opportunity for me to lose myself in this natural setting. Yeah. It's not that there aren't any other people around or that there aren't any houses in the distance, but for me, and I've been working in that room for a long time, it's the place to be. I keep a sign on the wall next to my desk, and it says, "Get on with it." And that's my mantra, get on with it.
We eagerly await volume 3 of this one and whatever else follows.
Thank you, Steve.
Rick Atkinson, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.